Good morning, everyone. It's 11:30, so trying to be cognizant of everyone's time and schedule. Let's go ahead and get started as looks like we're still having people join us, but they can catch up. My name is Grant Swartzwelder, President of OTA Compression and Chemark Systems. Welcome to our second weekly Lunch and Learn, but I've been told it's a BYOL, bring your own lunch, because of the virtual nature of it. But this, as you recall from our introduction last week, is really meant to be a way for OTA and Chemark to give back to the industry, to provide additional input on various topics. Last week, we spoke on environmental issues associated with low oil price environment, having to shut in wells, LDAR, regulatory concerns. There was we did not take a recording of it. That was my fault, but we do have a transcript. And so if you're interested in receiving that, contact one of your OTA representatives, and we'll be sure and get that for you. This one, I believe, is being recorded. Since I'm in charge of that, that still remains to be seen after this event. So fingers crossed. If not, we'll also have a transcript of it, but I believe it will be recorded and provided to you. Last week was on the environmental issues associated with low oil price. This week is going to be speaking about the facilities issues associated with low oil price. You have quite a few people shutting in wells, having to reduce their field service work, trying to save cost, but that comes with some risk, some ramifications. And to speak about that, we have Bobby Gossett, who's the Vice President of Operations for OTA, but has close to 25 years of facilities and field experience, most recently as production superintendent for Jagged Peak, and before that, Intervest. So he's lived this this situation several times, unfortunately, for the industry, but can bring, I think, some good experience to this presentation. You will see, if you roll down your cursor to the bottom, there will be a place to ask questions. If you do have any questions, we will address those at the end. We'll go from 11:30 till 12 o'clock. About 11:40, about 11:50, we will start looking at the questions and be able to quickly end at 12 to, again, be considerate of everyone's time. As a reminder, next week we will be doing this. It's having to do with issues related to PPP, the loan documents. Those things are continuing to change the requirements, but we have an individual that heads a large bank in Dallas that's been working on this to give some helpful hints on what you need to be doing. Then the week after that, we will have a partner with the Dallas law firm talking about bankruptcy, as to what effect it could have on your customer or your customer relationship, and then also if you potentially might be looking at it. But either way, bankruptcy will affect you either in the vendor-customer relationship or yourself. And thought that would be a very helpful presentation. So with that, let's turn to the meat of this presentation. Bobby, appreciate you being here, and let's start off with kind of a general question. Given that the low price environment exists right now, as I mentioned, a lot of people are looking to save cost by reducing PMs, reducing equipment, taking equipment offline. What are some of the options that they have besides that to save money facility-wise, and then what are some of the ramifications of that?
That's a great question, Grant, and I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to present for this week's webinar. The oil and gas industry is more than an industry to a lot of us. It's like a family. So if there's one positive thing that can come out of times like these, is to see how the industry pulls together and works better on focusing on efficiencies and just doing what we do better at lower cost. So, you know, if you're considering shutting in facilities, which I think a lot of operators are, a lot of activity is coming to a halt. There are a lot of costs that you can cut in doing so. Some of your main cost drivers that operators see are saltwater disposal cost, chemical program cost, continuous injection. Really, I can go on and on with the list. So shutting in a well definitely does away with a big chunk of those. And the main consideration, you can trim back on your maintenance programs, but you need to be careful what you trim back on, or a lot of those costs can come back up towards the end of your shut-in. A lot of operators are going to have to produce their wells every 30 days to fulfill lease obligations and to show some production or work on the well. So you need that facility to be ready to go without issue, so that you can avoid large costs.
I know you said that they might need to keep production going for their lease, and that seems to be something, and I know you're not a lawyer, but something that is well worth us all trying to figure out, because if you look at legal opinions, you can not have production for a year or two, but then you have others, and I think it's more for specifically their lease, that if their lease might require production. So it sounds like people really need to understand their specific situation to know whether they can shut it in completely or they have to have production for a few days.
Absolutely. Definitely depends on how the leases are written. You definitely need to understand that and understand what the obligations are to maintain that lease, or you could end up essentially losing assets.
So when you're looking to do preventative maintenance on your equipment, take care of your equipment, how do you decide whether you can push that out? Well, either stop it, or do you need to continue it? Or if you continue it, can you push it out additional days, like go from a 30-day PM to a 45 or 60-day PM? How do you figure out which of those you can do?
Well, you need to look at each situation individually and really design a maintenance program around your facilities, your operation, the equipment that you have on that facility. Like I say, if you're planning on producing these wells at any given interval, some sort of PM needs to be done to ensure that that equipment's ready to go for that one day or however long you're going to produce for that 30-day interval. You got to make sure all that equipment it's like parking your truck. You know, it's a simple comparison, but if I were to park my truck and not keep the batteries charged when I need it, it's not going to be available to me.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think knowing your location is so critical because, you know, there's certain pieces of equipment that are more sensitive to downtime than others. And also, I guess, depending on what's on your location, you know, if you have more sour gas or some issues like that, then it might create more issues the longer it's shut in or not PM'd.
Absolutely. Anything mechanical and that requires lubrication to operate, like your VRUs, your natural gas compressors, those aren't designed to sit. The lubrication systems require that unit to be rotated to keep that lubrication internally. H2S left in those in a shutdown situation is going to cause some severe corrosion and probably a failure down the road. So there's a lot of things that you want to look at. There's a lot of things you need to keep operational, even though you're down. You know, you may want to keep your flare going to keep your emissions down from your tanks. As these temperatures are warming up outside, you're getting a lot of vapors break out of your oil that may still be in your storage tanks. You know, you need to keep those pilots working on your flares. You may not need to perform your oil changes anymore on your VRUs or your compressors because you don't have the runtime, but to go out there and start it up for a few hours, maybe once a week, and make sure that periodically you're going out, making sure the batteries are charged up, making sure, you know, your shutdowns are still functional for safety purposes. But like I say, you just want to make sure that when you need it, it's ready to go and it's going to work properly.
So the considerations that you might have for idling that equipment, it sounds like water, H2S, and what are some other things you need to worry about, and then how do you respond to those?
Yeah, I think definitely if you have high H2S, that's one of the main concerns. We at OTA, we've specifically come up with scenarios for PMs on shutdown wells, so specific checklist, as I say, designed and catered to what our customers' current situation is. So if there's a high H2S facility, definitely want to isolate that unit, blow it down, even consider purging that unit to some extent. But,
You hear
some
about
other,
like pickling equipment or TA temporarily abandoning that. At what point do you need to go to that extreme? And well, first explain what a pickling equipment is, and then when do you, that's a more severe storage. So at what point do you do that?
yeah, I would only pickle equipment if you're planning on very long periods of time and not needing that equipment. So if
What's a long period of time? A month or 6 months, or how
yeah,
does that
I
work?
would say beyond 6 months, you're looking at a long. Then I would consider actually disconnecting that equipment and taking additional measures to pretty much permanently prepare that unit to sit. But like I say, a lot of these are, I wouldn't pickle anything that you're planning on needing to intermittently produce that you need to be operational. Otherwise, you're going to be pickling that unit over and over, and that's additional cost that we don't want to run into.
Now explain what pickling is, just so some people might not understand what that means and why you're saying what you're saying.
Sure, it's kind of a loose term, but you can go to additional measures for mechanical equipment. We can fog cylinders. We like to disconnect the unit, make sure there's no risk of leaky valves, allowing H2S or any other gas to sit in that unit, given that it's not being rotated. Uh, Tape up all of your inlets and outlets and basically any openings to atmosphere. Just oil breather caps keep dirt daubers out. I mean, dirt daubers can wreak havoc. It sounds simple, but we've had a lot of facilities that we built before we complete, and they would sit for a period of time. And I think dirt daubers were one of our largest headaches with, Kimrays and motor valves. Anything with a breather cap, it would plug up quickly. And, that something so simple can lead to, large events, big spills, fires out your flare, things of that nature. So, as simple as it may sound, it's a serious consideration.
Yeah, well, a lot of varmints, rats, chewing on wires, dirt daubers. It's amazing how nature can really raise havoc on equipment. One place it seems like pickling might be appropriate is we're seeing a lot of folks with the reduction in their production, they're taking the equipment off location and putting it back in their yard. And I've had calls to come out and look at equipment where it's all lined up on their fence line, but it's been there for a year or two. And by then, if it hasn't been stored completely, then it really becomes very expensive to fix.
No, I agree. Yeah, if you didn't take the precautions up front, then there's going to be money to spend to bring that piece of equipment back up to, quality operational condition.
So when you're looking at kind of either slowing down or shutting things in to make sure that it's easier to start up, either for those few days or when you decide to go back in production, are there things that you can do or think about? You've mentioned a couple, like turning over a compressor and checking battery. Are there any other things that might be need to be considered?
We'd always do when we would build a facility before we'd ever bring it online. We would take several checklists. The two main was commissioning checklist after a facility is built to make sure that everything was done properly and assembled completely. But I think one of the most important things that we did that I found the most value in was a pre-startup safety review. We use the acronym PSSR. I would recommend something similar for a shutdown situation. You don't even have to change the acronym. We can say a pre-shutdown safety review, just to go through and make sure that we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's. The list is really quite long of things that you want to double check, but some more important things that come to mind to me are like your pressure safety valves, your PSVs, making sure your rain caps are on those, making sure that the 90s on the horizontal outlet of those can drain water, so that those things, those safety devices, and really any other moving parts on that facility are protected, lubricated. Like I said, I could go on and we don't really have the time, but I'm happy to go, visit off the call with anybody who may have questions or want some guidance into ideas of things that can be added to such a checklist. But I think that that would be a very valuable practice to make sure that, you know, those things don't bite you when you're ready to come back online.
Yeah, and it seems like having a checklist like you described is really helpful to make sure, because especially with the turnover that you had on individuals and pumpers and all, to really make sure that you know what that everything is being done consistently is really key, because otherwise you're not going to know if they reversed an action that they did earlier and you find yourself in trouble. So I think that's I think that you know, you brought up the comment about safety, and I think there is a aspect of safety in this whole thing, because a lot of times you're dealing with 480 volt electricity, you're dealing obviously with movable equipment. What are some considerations? I know, like, we do a lot of lockout tagout. Would that be appropriate to do when you're shutting some of this in temporarily, or what are some safety considerations?
Well, there's quite a few, because you're not under normal operating circumstances. You're likely operating with less personnel than you really need. A lot of times, you know, we would have an operator at the well and an operator at the facility. You know, having multiple operators watching multiple points of the facility, it may not be a luxury that you have in this market environment. You may even have employees who are wearing multiple hats that typically that wasn't their scope of work prior to this layoffs or whatever it may be. So manpower is huge. Lockout, tagout, I'm glad you brought that up. You know, if you're going to go in, we're going to shut in facilities, we're going to isolate segments, we're going to blow down equipment, purge lines. You really need to apply lockout, tagout. That makes, when we're bringing on facilities, some of the biggest headaches or near misses that I've seen were due to, oh, I didn't know that valve was closed. Or, you know, it's very likely the person who shut that facility in is not going to be the same person bringing that facility online. So it requires additional attention. It really requires you to be on your toes, have guys that know what they're doing. Because it's when you have all of that pressure, you know, some portion of formation pressure after a shut-in, it can get dangerous quick if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, the whole electrical side has always made me very nervous. You know, 110, 120 volt, of course, but definitely 480 volt. And this seems like what you said, between wasp or dirt daubers or just whatever, it could, or a rat chewing wires. It seems like you're being set up for potential issues on the electrical side.
Yes, I'd agree. You know, prior to shutdown, that could be part of your shutdown list of things to do, is de-energize that equipment, you know, pull the fuses from your service pole to make sure, you know, just to double make sure that nothing's energized out there.
You know, and a side of that is, or kind of flip is, there are still the need to make sure your equipment is working. And like flares, for example, there was a study recently done where 10% of all flares in the Permian Basin are not operational when they should be. Now, we'll see if it's hard to know what they've looked at and all, but, you know, my experience driving around, that's probably the case. But, you know, what type of PM or what type of oversight to do things like that are critical for the environmental side of the business or safety side? You know, how far out can you go on PMs, or what can you do to maybe cut costs some, but stay within the compliance of the safety and environmental needs of your location?
Yeah, I think a lot of operators are going to be surprised when they, you know, you're expecting a uneventful LDAR survey. We're still required to do LDAR surveys, so we're going to go out and we're going to survey those. I think you'll be surprised to find that you still have quite a few fugitives, even though you're shut in. So your tank vapors, or like I said before, so we really need to keep those flares operational all the time. You know, the pilot's in good shape, make sure that those vapors are getting out and incinerated properly.
And again, doing a PM on it is also different than just checking and making sure it works. Can you kind of differentiate the two of those between just kind of a spot check versus a PM?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, with the PM, you wanna bring that pilot down. You want to clean out your pilot orifice. They build up soot. There's a lot more to it than just to look up at the tip of the flare and say, yes, we're burning, and say that flare is functional. We need to cycle that pilot, turn everything off, make sure it comes back on automatically. We need to test our set points and test our shutdown and alarms if you're equipped with that. Make sure your batteries are charged up. Um, Make sure corrosion, the H2S, the CO2, that it hasn't corroded any piece of equipment and it's getting ready to fail. I'm a firm believer in you can prevent failures before they happen if you're truly
Sure.
thoroughly looking at your equipment.
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's well, and so it's a fine line between just checking on the equipment and putting off the PM, but at some point if you don't do a PM, you're going to create more issues, it sounds like. So we've been talking around this some, but specifically when you're shutting wells in, you're creating the potential for environmental risk by not having the PMs as often, or someone going out there as often. You're potentially creating environmental risk. What are some of those to think about, and how can you address some of those?
Yeah, I think a lot of your main environmental risks are going to come from corrosion and your risk of spills. Spills get costly very quickly, especially when we're running, short of manpower. We're not physically visiting these locations as often as we were. So if you were to have a mechanical or an integrity failure, by the time you find it, it may be larger than you'd like it to be. Of course, any spill is larger than you like it to be, but all that money that you just saved in OpEx could go right back into a cleanup effort. There's a lot of things to think about when you're shutting in facilities, especially if you have any form of steel pipelines. I mean, there's a lot of things that can bite you. You have H2S, we have CO2, and one of my big concerns will be bacteria in a stagnant line. If we don't, it's probably good. There's, like I said, there's a whole long list of things that you can do, but I would think pigging, getting some biocide into that equipment, drain your vessels. Don't just let that sit in there and eat away at your integrity. We produce a lot of sand out here. 100 mesh sand settles out in tanks. A lot of this stuff is things that are probably included in your maintenance program already, in your PM program across your facilities and your infrastructure. They are things that I don't think should be eliminated completely. Continuous injection, yes, because you don't have the flow, but a spot treatment, a pigging program, cleaning that sediment out of your tanks and your vessels so that bacteria can't grow underneath and eat you up. Even if you have polyflow lines or some form of flex flow lines where you're not dealing with steel, paraffin, all this oil, if it sits and cools off underground, you're gonna have some paraffin issues, and that could really bite you when you come back online if you get hit with a paraffin bridge and create safety hazards.
You're talking about paraffin. You also talked about the spills. Part of what we talked about last week was the number of individuals that are trying to maintain higher oil levels within their existing tanks, or even bringing in frac tanks or others to store additional oil. So it seems like it's becoming even just more heightened, the opportunity to have spills. And if you do have spills, it's going to be bigger because you're storing more oil or water or whatever, some type of oil filled fluid on location.
Yeah, and we spoke about maintenance, but remote monitoring is huge to prevent. It can really reduce your risk if you're watching. If you have some way to put in some kind of simple remote monitoring, if you don't have it already, continue to watch your tank levels, or have that ability to watch your tank levels, to watch pressures or wellhead pressures are huge. Even though a lot of us are shut in, a lot of operators are shut in, there's still a lot of operators out there that are still drilling and fracking. So you could have offset activity, you could still take offset frac hits. Those are things that, if you have a pumping unit sitting out there shut down, it could be a big mess really quick. So definitely, I would think your largest environmental consideration is your emissions, and number one is the risk of spill.
We have a question that kind of follows with that, talking about secondary containment pumps and any considerations for that.
Yeah, I brought up secondary containment pumps because I've had it bite me before, so I've made this mistake myself. But we've all gone to several operators have gone to these really nice secondary containments around their tank batteries, and it's not like an earthen berm; they don't leak, so they work really well. And we're coming up on storm season. A lot of us have sump pumps, automatic sump pumps in those secondary containments, and I have seen those fill storage tanks up and overflow them. So that comes along with remote monitoring and just watching that, because even though you're not producing in that facility, it doesn't mean there's not something there that might surprise you and cause a tank to overflow.
No, that makes a lot of sense there. And then I guess the last part is once and you've alluded to this with the checklist, but at some point, hopefully soon, oil price comes up. We bring all this equipment back on. I think it would help to go over that again. You've talked about it in parts throughout this, but you use this checklist. What are some other considerations in when you're ramping production back up or bringing something? You're either going from producing for 2 or 3 days to 30 days a month, or you're bringing it back on completely.
Like I say, the pre-startup checklist, hazard identification, the lockout tag out, walk through your facilities multiple times. Make sure that you've kept up with that equipment, even though you're down. I highly recommend you continue some sort of PM program, some sort of maintenance program. The main thing is being ready for when that time comes. If you've done all of those, then you should be in really good shape. That equipment should be ready to go.
Very good. Well, through this conversation, we've addressed several of the questions that we had, kind of just fed them through there. But if you have any other questions, either do it very quickly or please reach out to Bobby after this, or again, one of your OTA Chemark representatives, and they can get you in touch with Bobby. And he's out of West Texas right now, but also doing quite a bit down in South Texas. So he can meet with you if that would be helpful. Thank you, Bobby, for participating today. Again, a reminder is that next Wednesday we'll be talking about PPP loans, and then the Wednesday after that talking about bankruptcy, how it might affect your customers and your relationship with customers, but then also looking at how if you're thinking about having to do something more dire like do bankruptcy, then this individual will be able to help. I'm stuttering here because I'm looking at a question from Mike. It says, we had a spill when we shut in a tank battery, but we didn't close the block valve between the battery and the SW or saltwater disposal system, and the saltwater disposal system backflowed through a failed check valve and overflowed the battery. It was in New Mexico, so you can only imagine how much that was. So he suggested closing the block valves, but then also and downstream of the battery. Anything to add to that, Bobby?
No, I agree completely. He's reiterating that even though you have you're shut in at the wellhead, it kind of comes from the rainwater source. There are other ways that you can get flow into that facility. So downstream from a failed check valve is definitely one of them, from a saltwater disposal system. And I just want to tell everybody, feel free to reach out if you want to go more in depth with a discussion on checklists and things that you might want to consider, or maybe you haven't thought about. I'd be glad to have those conversations with anyone who's interested. There's a lot more considerations that I didn't bring up, how to have your artificial lift on standby, pumping units, gas lift. So there's quite a bit more than we just really scratched the surface. So.
Very good. Yeah, trying to be considerate of time, and it is 11:59 now. So Bobby, you did a great job of keeping it within. So with that, let's say thanks to everyone for participating. Let us know if we can help. Hopefully you found this information helpful to improve your operations and be ready for when oil prices jump back up and we're out of this mess. So thanks for everyone's attention and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday or the Wednesday after. Take care, everyone.